In this lesson you will learn about simple and compound meter, and I'll talk in more detail about time signatures. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to define and distinguish between simple and compound meters. You should have a better understanding of time signatures. You should be able to determine the meter of a piece of music or excerpt, and you should be able to beam groups of notes correctly. You'll recall from the previous lecture that meter is the organization of beats into regularly recurring patterns of strong and weak. There are two types of meter that we will discuss, and they're defined in terms of how the beat is divided. All of the examples in the last lesson were in simple meter. In simple meter, the beat is divisible by 2. If the beat is a quarter note, then it's divided into 2 eighth notes. If the beat is a half note, it is divided into 2 quarter notes. The other kind of meter, compound meter, emerges when the beat is divisible by 3. There's a small problem here, however, as our standard note values, things like quarters, halves, and eighths, don't divide neatly into 3. In order to divide the beat equally into 3, we need to indicate the beat or pulse with a dotted note value. We can divide a dotted quarter note evenly into 3 eighth notes, as you see here. This is one way to visually identify simple or compound meter. If a dotted note value appears to be the unit of the pulse, then the meter is compound. If an undotted note value appears to be the unit of the pulse, then the meter is simple. We can usually tell what the meter is by looking at the time signature. In the last lesson, I implied that the top note tells you how many beats are in a measure, and the bottom note tells you which note is the unit of pulse. This remains true for simple meter, but not for compound meter. Let's take a common time signature associated with compound meter, 6/8. This example is the opening of the first movement of Mozart's piano sonata at Koelschel 331. You might take a minute to find a recording on the library site or on YouTube and listen to it a few times. To say that there are 6 pulses in the measure, and the eighth note is the unit of the pulse, misses the way this meter is typically experienced, and it doesn't accord with our definition of compound meter. More often than not, 6/8 is performed and or heard as having 2 beats, and each beat is divisible by 3. We can call 6/8 a compound duple meter then, because there are 2 beats in the measure and the beat is divisible by 3. Try listening to the passage and conducting along in a duple meter. You'll also notice that many of the eighth notes in this passage are beamed in such a way that they reflect 2 big beats. You can see here this passage that I've bracketed in red suggests 1 beat, 2 beat, 1 beat, 2 beat. Up here, 1 beat, 2 beat, 1 beat, 2 beat. Here are a few examples of melodies in compound meters. The melodies in the top line all have the dotted quarter as the beat unit. Compound meters with a 6 on top are duple, those with a 9 on top are triple, and those with a 12 on top are quadruple. The melodies in the second line all have the dotted half as the beat note. In performance, the melodies in the bottom line would sound exactly the same as the melodies in the top line. It would be impossible to tell if you were hearing 6/8 or 6/4. However, you should be able to identify what you're hearing as a compound duple meter. As a general rule, when the top number in a time signature is 6, 9, or 12, you can safely assume that you're dealing with a compound meter. To find the number of beats in the measure, simply divide the top number by 3. It is important to mention here that time signatures with a 3 as their top number are simple meters. They are never compound. Here are a few melodies in some common simple meters. Time signatures with a 2 on top are duple, those with a 3 on top are triple, and those with a 4 on top are quadruple. The melodies on the top line all have the quarter note as the beat unit. The melodies on the second line all have the half note as the beat unit, and the melodies on the third line all have the eighth note as the beat unit. All of the simple duple melodies would be performed in exactly the same way. It would be impossible to tell just by listening if you were listening to 2/4, 2/2, or 2/8. Sometimes in place of a numerical time signature, you will see either a C or a C with a vertical line through it. The C stands for common time, and the C with a line through it stands for cut time. Common time is identical to a simple quadruple meter, most often written as 4/4. Cut time is identical to a simple duple meter, most often written 2/2. It is important to remember that time signatures have no correlation to tempo. Cut time isn't inherently faster than common time. 3/8 isn't any faster than 3/4 or 3/2. All the time signature does is explain the meter to you. It doesn't tell you anything about the tempo. In the previous lesson, I talked a bit about flags versus beams. Now that you have a better understanding of meter, I want to clarify a few principles of beaming. You'll recall that flags are most often used in vocal music, and they tend to correspond to the syllabification of the text. Each syllable gets its own flagged note. When we use beams, we do so in an effort to make the meter clear to the performer. Here are a few of our short melodies from earlier in the lesson. On the top line, I've rewritten them with flags. Now there's nothing inherently wrong with this. If you look at the second line, you can see that beaming clearly groups the notes together in such a way that the underlying meter is clarified. Put another way, notes that constitute divisions of the beat are linked together to clarify the beat. You can see each one of these corresponds to a beat, and we can see that through the beaming. Each of these is a division of the beat. These two divisions are grouped together and they show me that that's one beat. These are all grouped together. That shows me that these are subdivisions of one big beat. So it's very easy to see from this notation 1, 2, 1, 2. It's very easy to see 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And within that it's easy to see that my beats are divided into twos. At the bottom of this slide, I've added a melody with haphazard beaming and stemming. Looking at the bottom staff, it becomes difficult to tell how the notes fit into the underlying metrical structure. It's a bit like your eyes are playing tricks on you because they want the beam notes to coincide with a beat. Try performing each of these lines using either conducting or takkadimi or conducting and solfege. Which line was easiest to perform and which one was most difficult? Having said all this, there aren't any really hard and fast rules for beaming, but the guiding principle should be that beaming always clarifies the meter, clarifies the beat, and never obscures it. Sometimes composers will switch back and forth between simple and compound divisions, but they won't change the time signature. You probably recognize these as triplets, duplets, and other tuplets. They're generally grouped together somehow, usually beamed, and indicated with a small number over the grouping. This example comes from the last movement of Haydn's Emperor String Quartet. We looked a bit at the second movement of this quartet in our very first lesson on clefs and the staff. Even without a time signature, we can see that this is in 4/4, a simple quadruple meter. The second violin part in here, and later the viola part, offers us pretty good evidence of this. The first violin part here in the top staff starts its passage with triplets. You can see 3 notes are beamed together and there's a little number 3 over top of it. Halfway through, it switches back into simple divisions of the beats with 8th notes, and here Haydn has beamed the 8th notes in groups of 4. I'll take a second and play this example for you. You'll hear a couple of big chords, and then this passage will go by. At this point, you should be able to define and distinguish between simple and compound meters. You should have a better understanding of time signatures. You should be able to determine the meter of a piece of music or excerpt, and be able to beam groups of notes correctly. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to post them to the discussion board and take some time to answer your classmates' questions as well. You'll need to take the quiz associated with this before you can move on to the next lesson and before coming to class. Make sure, too, that you're thinking through and working on the homework that's due on Monday.